Oh,
We good?
yep.
Okay,
Yeah.
cool. Hello, my name is Reagan Buterbaugh, and I would like to introduce you to our group presentation. We are group four. We will be discussing chapter six of Reimagining Capitalism in a World on Fire, and our goal is to inform you all of the chapter's key points and lessons to be learned. Um, We will be speaking about seven subsections of the chapter, followed by our conclusion that will be based on our findings from the chapter. So stay tuned because at the end there will be a quick quiz based on our key points that we've covered. Um, as you all may know, the book is called Reimagining Capitalism in a World on Fire. It was written by Rebecca Henderson and it was published by Public Affairs in 2020. And so the chapter's introduction begins with Rebecca Henderson positing a question to the reader, asking, "Is rewiring finance enough to rewire capitalism?" She follows this up by explaining that even if every organization on the planet decided to seek a purpose beyond profit, we would still encounter issues like climate change and inequality. This is because many issues that cause climate change and inequality are public good issues that a firm cannot simply solve themselves. Competitors will do what they must to beat the competition, even if that means cutting down forests. So, a possible solution that she explains is industry self-regulation, in which an industry joins forces to make widespread changes that better the industry as a whole. And she backs this up with research done by economic scientist Eleanor Ostrom that suggests that local coordination creates change that endures over generations and often outperforms government regulation. So, despite the fact that cooperation is a very fickle and fragile thing, like she discusses, Henderson makes it clear that cooperative efforts can lay the groundwork for better solutions in the future, which moves into the section Orangutans on the Building. Henderson provides an example of how industry self-regulation proved itself in a time of crisis. So in 2008, Unilever employees arrived to find that eight protesters dressed as orangutans had climbed above their headquarters. And the protesters were angry at Dove, a company under Unilever, for using palm oil in its products that was harvested by destroying jungle habitats that were home to orangutans. Um, as a means of lessening the criticism that was coming in from the media storm, former CEO Patrick Seskow publicly pledged that by 2020, Unilever and its companies would only use sustainably sourced palm oil, except no one actually knew how to implement these changes when he announced this. So Seskow was eventually replaced by Paul Pullman in 2009. And he came in with a chip on his shoulder and boldly announced that he would end the tradition of offering earnings guidance at Unilever, which ended up resulting in nearly $2.2 billion losses of market capitalization. He believed that the focus needed to shift to implementing the sustainability promises the company had made so that the business results would come later, as seen in this quote that's on the page. In doing so, other companies like Nestle and Procter and Gamble decided to join Unilever in using ethically sourced palm oil. Henderson closes this section by explaining that industry cooperation such as this can be more effective than government regulations, especially since governments can be corrupt or just poor enforcers. So then, moving forward is Evita.
Okay, so I read about the suffers that Chicago had in the late 1800s from severe air pollution. Factories and locomotives were producing a thick, greasy black smoke, damaging goods, buildings, and health. In 1890, Chicago was preparing to host the World's Fair, and the fair designers wanted to showcase the beautiful city's beauty by having big white architectural buildings. They feared that all the white plaster would soon be coated in soot from the city's smoke. In order to fix this, Chicago's business elite formed the for the Prevention of Smoke in 1892. Their goal was to clean up the city before the fair opened. This was one of the first organized efforts at industrial self-regulation in the US. The society paid engineers to help factories reduce smoke, and they also issued hundreds of reports, and about 60% of businessmen took action. They also hired lawyers to enforce the city's anti-smoke law, filing more than 300 lawsuits. By 1892, downtown smoke was largely under control. This episode shows that the early efforts at pollution control often depended on the business's cooperation, and that sustainable progress requires both economic stability and public trust.
Now I'm going to be talking about building cooperation at a global scale. So my section posed the question, can cooperation be sustained in a global, more spread out setting? And the answer to this was it's complicated. So this section used the example of the palm oil industry. And as alluded to earlier, the CEO of Unilever, Paul Pullman, he wanted to socialize this problem. And there was a ad released by Greenpeace about Kit Kat. And if you weren't aware, Kit Kat is owned by the brand Nestle. And Nestle is one of those large corporations like Unilever, PepsiCo, Coca-Cola, like that. And the ad showed a man biting into a Kit Kat, which turned out to be an orangutan's finger, and there was blood, and I won't get any further into that, but the ad was very shocking to most people, but it was a major, it alluded to the deforestation that was happening because of the palm oil industry and the ingredients that went into Kit Kat. And so Unilever wanted to jump ahead of this. They wanted to be on top of it. And so they said, we're going to switch to sustainable palm oil. And then I wanted to talk about this quote down here. It says, "It has become clear that the only way to solve this problem is in partnership with investors, local communities, and with local governments." So now Unilever was on this mission to address deforestation in the palm oil industry and how can they go best about that. And it is through investors, local communities, and local governments. And so now I want to talk about other global efforts and systemic challenges such as deforestation, ocean pollution, overfishing, corruption, and abusive labor conditions, and how they cannot be solved alone. They cannot be solved by one firm. And so wanted to talk about competitive disadvantage. So if we're looking at the top 15 corporations, if 14 out of 15 of those corporations were committed to sustainability, but then one would not, that would lead to a competitive disadvantage and how cooperation can help level the playing field overall. So if all 15 corporations are on the same page, then now we're on a level playing field. So back in 2010, there was a meeting of the top 15 consumer good companies, which focused on sustainability and specifically deforestation. The Consumer Good Forum members had a commitment to zero net deforestation by 2020 under the four commodities of soy, paper, beef, and palm oil. But this led to the issue of defining self-regulation and free riding. So self-regulation is only stable when all the parties to an agreement believe that it is in their collective interest. But this led to the problem of free riding, where many corporations were promising to use sustainable oil but not doing it. So how do you keep how do you keep cooperation in corporations like accountable? And to do this, industries need to understand that cooperation is inevitably in their best interests. And free riding has to be addressed. Companies need to hold each other accountable and that there is no easy way out. There needs to be trust, respect, and clear communication. And then my section also wanted to define what is sustainable palm oil. So when we're talking about sustainable palm oil, we're talking about no deforestation and protecting areas of high conservation, areas where there is high biodiversity and you want to keep ecosystems flourishing. There's fair labor conditions, respect to local communities, and sustainable management, where some corporations are even incorporating like drone monitoring to make sure that people are doing their jobs properly. Also, I want to talk about how standards are also always changing. And in the sustainability field, there's a term called the ceiling, which is the best available knowledge at the time. And this ceiling is constantly raising or lowering. And it's important to address it, especially when talking about the palm oil industry. And those 15 corporations that decided that they were going to lower their deforestation impact found that the initiative was insufficient. Deforestation continued, and at times it even doubled. 27% of rainforests were cleared in Indonesia between 2010 and 2018. The only positive that came from this is that it increased the odds of stopping it going forward. So people were now more aware of what was going on within the industry. And it shows that industry-wide cooperation aimed to help firms to meet their promise of using sustainable oil, but in the end, it did not fix the underlying problem. So then this brings up how cooperation is used within this example. So persuasion is power here. Persuading consumers to push local firms to use sustainable oil or persuading local governments to enforce laws against deforestation. This was explained in my section, and how growing sustainable oil is more economically attractive to smallholders. So making the issue of sustainable oil more feasible, wanting to create that demand and showing that there is profit within sustainability. And then I also wanted to show industry-wide cooperation will establish a demand for sustainably produced products, but in the end, government support will be critical to making progress. This shows that it takes both the local and governmental involvement to implement a global cooperation. And then finally, what are the current solutions going on right now? So the Consumer Goods Forum has regular meetings with a broad range of stakeholders, including non-governmental organizations such as the World Wildlife Fund and local communities and politicians. They're following the jurisdictional approach, which is building partnerships more locally. So they're striving for a business case that can convert entire regions to use more sustainable palm. And then they're also, again, implementing those self-regulatory efforts and shifting capitalism from competition to cooperation through shared value and purpose, and asking the question, what can we do together?
Okay, so what makes the difference? Key factors for successful self-regulation. All participants must have clear shared incentives in order to cooperate. Self-regulation works best when participants are in it for long term, with investments that would be lost if the industry were to fail. Monitoring is effective for ensuring that everyone is following the rules. Things like regular inspections make it easier to spot violations and encourage safety. Finally, there must be clear consequences for those who do not comply, like applying pressure from board and head of directors.
Okay, so I had the last two subsections. Um, the first one was cooperation within the region. So basically, I'm talking about what cooperating with regions means. So firms must move beyond industry level collaboration and engage directly with regional networks, governments, and then local organizations. So many of the major challenges, so like climate change, inequality, the infrastructure development. So basically them are all rooted in the regional systems and require place-based solutions. So the regional cooperation helps align firms, governments, and civil society around shared goals, common infrastructure, and sustainable growth strategies. And because of all these regions can adapt so quickly, the approaches to local institutions, resources, and cultures, the cooperation becomes more realistic, effective, and enduring. So basically, just a little additional insight summary. So the strong regional collaboration builds connected communities where businesses' success and local well-being support one another. So when the regions focus on the sustainability and shared responsibility, they can become more powerful drivers of long-term inclusive growth overall. So the last section within that little subsection was the challenges and enablers in the regional cooperation. So the challenges. So I kind of just basically named the top three. So the free riding by firms in the region. So some benefits without contributing, the weak governance or limited enforcement of all of the regional um, communities' commitments, and then the mismatched incentives between firms based in the region and outside the firms. So going back to the enablers, So the strong regional institutions, so example like the governments and the local agencies, they act as governors or the enforcers overall. And then the mechanisms for shared metrics and accountability to track all of the progress. And then aligning economic initiatives, so the firms see cooperation as the win-win. So the local prosperity supports all of the long-term business success. So a little summary, additional insight. So that Henderson notes that without credibility, regional governance, or enforcement, the cooperation can remain fragile and vulnerable, like said earlier in the presentation. So successful regional cooperation depends on the building trust, the accountability, and the shared benefits, ensuring every stakeholder has both a reason and a responsibility to contribute. So the last section leading and ending the chapter was the investors as the enforcers. So why basically can the investors can act as the enforcers? So some of the bullet points ahead was beyond firms and governments, the investors play a critical role in driving responsible corporate behavior on the long-term cooperation. The large institutional investors and the universal owners can enforce or encourage sustainability, the transparency, and ethical business practices. So because all of the investors hold shares across many of the firms, they have a system-wide stake and can push for shared metrics and accountability. And so the firms may resist cooperation unless investors actually demand and reward collaboration. So using the tools like the shareholder voting, engagement, or the divestment. So basically of the summary, so when the investors use their influence to align the profit with purpose, they become more powerful drivers of the widespread sustainability, ensuring that the cooperation and accountability extends across the entire market rather than just the individual firms. So the practical insights and summing up the last subsection, so the implications that can be made. So the firms must anticipate investor demands across sustainability, cooperation, and the long-term value. So the investors, in turn, need to look beyond the short-term profits and then consider the broader risks and impacts on their investments create. So the summary, the subsection closes the chapter by trying to um, cooperation and the governance. So for the regional cooperation and the broader system chains, the investors are part of the enforcement architecture. So Henderson warns that without the investors stepping in, the system remains too dependent on the voluntary cooperation and the weak governance. So the additional insight, so lasting change depends on the investors using their influence to promote accountability, supporting the good of the government, and help ensure that the capitalism benefits both markets and society in the long run.
Next, we had our conclusion and key points. So overall, cooperation is necessary for creating change in ethical and sustainable business practices. The key points to take away here are when addressing issues such as climate change or deforestation, firms are not sufficient on their own. Collective action and cooperation is necessary. Public good problems must be solved through collective action. Enforcers such as large-scale investors can motivate firms to make lasting cooperative efforts, and overall, change is difficult, but it is possible. And then we have a quick pop quiz. So you're going to take this time to record your answers on a separate sheet of paper. And our first question is true or false, industry self-regulation is a successful tactic for cooperation and sustainability efforts. Number 2, which industry was used as an example throughout the chapter to describe ongoing sustainability issues? And number 3, what are 2 key challenges in regional cooperation? And then our solutions are true for number 1, the palm industry for number 2, and then some challenges included free riding, weak governance, or mismatched incentives. And then we would like to thank you guys for watching, and we hope you enjoyed.